Okay, hello everyone. I welcome all of you to the first Fulbright Forum of the 2012 and 2013 program year. We appreciate all of you coming today despite your hectic schedules. We hope today offers you an informative and engaging look at some of the research we sponsor here at Fulbright. It is my pleasure to present Andrew Arnold, a junior researcher and a graduate of International Affairs and Japanese at the University of Georgia. During his undergraduate career, he began his studies of Korean language, culture, and film under the tutelage of Dr. Hyang-Sun Lee, whose acclaimed research in the study of Buddhist women monastics forced Andrew's own interest in Korean Buddhism. He was the first grantee in his year to arrive and has worked diligently to explore the intricacy of Korean Engaged Buddhism. In the coming hour, Andrew will share with us his investigation of the emergence of Engaged Buddhism in Korea. His work is creative in nature, and he has dedicated his time to the creation of a documentary informing the spectrum and state of engaged Buddhism. From interviews with activists to leaders in the community, Andrew has examined the trend in the rise of engaged Buddhism and its impact in Korea. The dynamics of Buddhist order and its role in Korea have evolved much like Korea has in the last few decades, taking on a role of greater importance internationally. In an endeavor to understand the relationship between society, politics, and religion, Andrew examined the actions of prominent individuals through their words, actions, shedding light on the relevance and contributions to Korea and international society. Thank you very much. Let's welcome Andrew.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I thought I was going to have to introduce my topic actually, but thank you so much, and thank you all for this wonderful turnout. I believe I have something. Maybe. No, I think I got it right here. Yes. Tonight, as Professor Shim mentioned, I will be looking and discussing this emerging engaged Buddhism in South Korea. And to begin, I want to go ahead and note that this is not a unique shift that's occurred in just Korea alone. In fact, could you dim the light maybe for just just over, yeah, just so you guys can see the photograph of here. His name is in the brochure or the flyer that I've put out there. Thich Nhat Hanh is the man who coined this term, Engaged Buddhism, during the 1960s, while the U.S. Civil Rights Movement was underway and the Vietnam War was occurring. And so in the Buddhist world, Thich Nhat Hanh is kind of a household name. And it's worth mentioning that he both studied and taught in the U.S. at Princeton and Columbia. And so during that time, in the 60s, he was in extensive dialogue with Martin Luther King Jr. And so the two have become national as well as international icons of nonviolent activism and demonstration. So in order to understand how this shift has occurred here in Korea, I think it's important for us to kind of understand the role of Buddhism in Korea historically and culturally. And then also, it's very important to create a definition of what engaged Buddhism is. But before we go there, I think it's best for me to begin by saying that I'm a storyteller. I'm aspiring to be a good storyteller. And so when I was given the opportunity to come to South Korea through the Fulbright program, I came equipped with my sketch pad and my camera and the mediums that I was most familiar with using. I was given a creative research grant, which means that my research and the output come in a creative output. Over the course of my presentation, I really hope that I can inspire everyone here, both academically and creatively. And I also hope that I can convey the messages that these monks and nuns have really devoted their lives to. They're taking on very, very modern issues, but through very deeply rooted morals and ethics. So, to begin, let's talk about Korean Buddhism. There are many schools of Buddhism in Korea, but the strongest and most distinct has uniquely defined itself as Son Buddhism among the Mahayana traditions. Son Buddhism stems from the Chinese Chan school, which we in the West we're most familiar with as Zen, Japanese Zen Buddhism. And those three have all come out of the same sutras and basic teachings, but they've all obviously been shaped by their cultural and historical circumstances. So, Son Buddhism in particular, I'd say is particularly strict among the Mahayana traditions, as Buddhism in Korea became the state religion during the Goryeo era, and remained strongly established until the beginning of the Joseon dynasty, when Buddhism started to crumble into corruption, and that led to a lot of anti-Buddhist sentiments. So, as some of you may know, or hopefully many of you know, the Joseon dynasty was built on Neo-Confucian ideology. And so that Neo-Confucian ideology really forced a big backlash against the Buddhist community, and many monks and nuns were actually eventually prohibited from entering city grounds. So that actually pushed monks and nuns way far into the mountains to continue their practice in seclusion. And that's part of the reason why you see so many temples when you go hiking in Korea in the mountains, tucked away. It's kind of, not just because Son Buddhism focuses on internal meditation and kind of the internal practice to reach enlightenment, but also because of the historical barriers that Confucianism put on the religion. But despite these centuries of repression under the Joseon Neo-Confucian ideology, Korean Buddhism survived and actually grew extensively in its confined capacity in seclusion. So, a really fascinating aspect, and actually part of something that drew me to Buddhism initially was, or not Buddhism, but Korean Buddhism specifically, was that Korea has the strongest, if not the strongest, one of the strongest traditions of women monastics, women nuns in Buddhist history. My introduction came from my professor, Dr. Hyung-sun Lee, and she has done all this research on women monastics and women in Buddhism. And so during the Joseon dynasty, actually, Buddhist women and nuns were under particular scrutiny. And there were often cases in which they were accused of having an illicit affair with a monk or something further to degrade the Buddhist name during the Joseon dynasty. So despite that even harsher kind of, battle that Buddhist nuns and women had to face during the time, the Bhikkhuni Sangha, or the women monastic lineage in Korea, not only survived but has actually helped reestablish lineages of women monastics in other countries where that religion, where that lineage has died out. So in other Buddhist countries where women want to become fully ordained nuns, they've actually come and studied in Korea to become fully ordained, and then they've gone back to their their home countries to re-establish those lineages. So I thought that's like a very fascinating aspect of Korean Buddhism, and you can kind of tell that historically, while historically, Son Buddhism has been very conservative in its teachings and practice. Monastics and monks and nuns strictly abide by vegetarian diets, celibacy, and have focused on strong internal practice. So there's this very strict, regulated lifestyle that Korean monks and nuns have followed, but at the same time, there's yet this simultaneous progressive side to Korean Buddhism, as I said, with the monastic lineage of women. And so there's been this progressive interaction with ethics and social interaction that's very deeply rooted. And Sun Buddhism has been very highly intellectual, and so this religion is really deeply embedded in the culture. And I'm going to steal this image from my professor. I think she puts it really perfectly. If you look at the religious component to the Korean identity as if it's an onion, okay, you have these many different layers that make up that aspect of the identity. And so on the outmost layer you have Christianity, which is the most recently established religion in Korea. But then underneath that you have the Neo-Confucian identity. And then further you have Buddhism. And then even deeper is shamanism. So if you look at it as if it's this onion, you can see how deeply rooted Buddhism is in Korean society. And despite whatever religious preference Koreans have in a personal way, there's very strong Buddhist ideals that are embedded in their cultural imprint, and that has really led to part of the reason why engaged Buddhism in Korea, this new form of Buddhism, has kind of occurred naturally. One other aspect that I want to look at is if you look at Buddhist temples in Korea, you'll find a very interesting relationship between structure and environment. If you compare Korean temple structures to Japanese temple structures, for instance, and I'll show a clip later, and so you'll be able to see a clip that I worked on as a part of the documentary that I'm constructing. You'll see, you can kind of look at the Japanese structures in that clip, but Japanese Buddhist aesthetics aim for symmetry, I think, and alignment. So you'll often see pillars that have all been cut in by the same dimensions in order to create a perfect shape. But Korean Buddhist aesthetics aim for harmony. And so as you can see in this image, they've left this tree trunk as its original form in constructing the building. And so when you look at, if you go to a Buddhist temple, I mean, it's varied, as you know, temples have been reconstructed, but if you go to extremely old temples, you'll see the structural kind of aesthetic. And also, a majority of Korean temples are built without using nails. So if it's necessary to move a temple site, the structure can be easily disassembled. And so just from that aspect, you can kind of, just from these two characteristics, these are very much Korean Buddhist aesthetic things that you won't find in other Buddhist traditions. But they show a certain kind of ingrained care for the environment that's specifically stable in this culture. So to move on to engaged Buddhism, creating a definition of what engaged Buddhism is, I want to talk about a conference I went to last November. I accompanied the Korean delegation to the International Network of Engaged Buddhists conference in Yokohama, Japan. And attending this conference really gave me a clear definition of what engaged Buddhism is, actually. I had done a lot of reading books on what engaged Buddhism was beforehand, but it wasn't until I went to this conference that I really built a much, I think, much more solid understanding of what this is. So I'll show this clip and then continue.
The wisdom of interbeing and the art of happiness, a Buddhist approach to rebuilding our society and ensuring our future. The foundation of all Buddhist practice, and without which there is no Buddhist practice, is sila, ethics, which means how to be normal and natural without exploiting oneself and others. Ethics in Buddhism begins with the understanding that we are not just observers in reality. Whether we like it or not, we participate with our bodies, our speech and our minds. The final phase of Buddhist practice is the cultivation of insight, where you explore the world as it exists, not independently of experience and consciousness, but rather the world of experience called in Sanskrit loka. The strategy of this begins with trying to discover the nature of the objects of consciousness, the object of mind.
Personal transformation and the link between that and social transformation.
You should go for change. It doesn't mean that you should wait for the change. You should start looking for the change. It's not that you just give lecture, you just speak the words. You should be drawn on actions. To take Buddhism more on spiritual line rather than just operating on religious line.
When we talk about religion, the way of life is very important for our community. So for that reason, we have to give the teachings from both sides, as well the community level as well as the caste peoples. So the Buddhism is the only philosophy to bring such kind of equality within our life.
It's a good thing to meditate, but if you stop a good person by body meditation, I think that's escapism, not Buddhism. So sila is not only to have a good ethical conduct, you must have social change. In order to put sila into moral setting, you have to understand structural violence in the world, how to restructure that, not to hate the oppressor, but to try to restore oppressive system. If you are Buddhist, you are encouraged to transform greed into generosity, to transform hatred into loving kindness, and to transform illusion into enlightenment, into wisdom.
This was the meeting of the, let me pull pull up the PowerPoint deck again so you guys can look at these beautiful faces. This was the Executive Board and Advisory Committee meeting of the INED group. So it wasn't the entire organization, but meeting these individuals gave me a much clearer idea of what Engaged Buddhism is in a much more modern setting. Each individual came to this meeting from a different country. There were various Buddhist backgrounds from different countries, including India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Taiwan, the US, Australia, Costa Rica, Korea, Japan. So there were just all of these different backgrounds that were all in the same room, but they all came essentially with the same purpose in mind, which was to act as a catalyst for progress and change in their home countries, as well as to support one another in their pursuits for changing the system, setting up educational programs, providing aid to impoverished and broken communities, protecting the environment. So from these interviews, it's clear that each individual kind of realizes the core behind their Buddhist values and acts in a dynamic and active way. During the interview with Ajahn Sulak, he was the man who spoke both at the beginning and at the end of the video. He's the founder of INED. He distinguished the difference between Big B Buddhism and Little B Buddhism. So Big B Buddhism is the religious structure and the institution of Buddhism, and that allows Buddhism in a way to become nationalistic. An example of this from the Korean history would be the way in which Korean Buddhist monks formed an army during the Japanese invasion during the 1500s, when Buddhism in Korea had the capacity to be Big B Buddhism, to be the institutional and the religious structure that it had the ability to during that time. On the other hand, Little B Buddhism is the Dhamma and the practice. It's the skillful application of one's beliefs without having to do so in the name of Buddhism. So when I was talking to Ajahn Sulak, he said, this makes interfaith work a lot easier. There's this kind of capacity that engaged Buddhists have to work within their community without presenting any sort of religious stipulation. Essentially, they were going beyond their dogmatic expressions of religion and actively incorporating the values in an everyday kind of way. To move on now, I've kind of created like an understanding of, okay, well, this is Korean Buddhism, and then this is Engaged Buddhism. So let's kind of figure out where they've matched and mingled in the present. And there's many figures in Korean Buddhism that are many monks and nuns who have stood up and become major symbols of environmentalism and engaged Buddhism. But I've narrowed it down to 3, and I want to start with this woman, this nun, Jiru Sunim, because she's actually the reason why I came to Korea. Initially, I had really wanted to work on a documentary that just examined her, because in a way I thought that her story provided a microcosmic look at what Engaged Buddhism was in South Korea. And as I'll explain, that is not the case. But when I had first heard her story, I became kind of transfixed. Her method of activism in environmentalism drew a lot of attention from the media, the Buddhist community in Korea, and also on an international scale. She got a lot of attention for her actions. So to give the story that I heard, that initially jogged my interest, we're going to start back in 2002, when the Korean government was constructing the KTX train between Seoul and Busan, and the train route went through a mountain called Cheonsong Mountain, and that happened to be the location of Jio-sunim's temple that she was living at. And at the time, she was situated in the Hermitage, the Temple Hermitage, which is not at the primary temple site. In fact, it's a bit more pushed up further away from society, even further from the temple site, as a location where monks and nuns can go to meditate day in and day out. It's a silent location. So although she had focused on being removed from society and focusing on her own internal practice, when Jio-sunim heard about the KTX plans, she did this 180. She completely I'm just not going to do this meditation anymore. I'm going to go fully into social practice, and so she began a series of very innovative, very different forms of peaceful demonstrations against the construction, and that included waging a representative lawsuit against the Korea Rail Authority, the Korea Rail Network Authority, on behalf of an endangered salamander. That also included her doing a Sambo Ilbe pilgrimage, which is a 3 steps, 1 bow pilgrimage. So she started in Busan, and then she went on a route to the the mountain, and every 3 steps that she took, she did a full prostration. Beyond that, she also committed herself to a series of fasts, and she ended up starving herself for a total of 200 days. So by the end of her campaign, she had severely weakened her body. When she could no longer carry on her campaign, she had stalled the project for several years, and it had cost the government millions of dollars. And so as you can imagine, this campaign gave Jewel a very controversial reputation, and she received a lot of backlash from the media, and much of the support that she had originally had from the Buddhist community backed out as the going got tough, as her actions started to gain more and more of an infamous reputation. So a couple of years after recovering, Jio began a second campaign, and that's happening now, actually, or a little bit prior to when I arrived. And this campaign was against the Lee Myung-bak administration's dam construction project on the Naesan River. The dam construction was a part of a larger government, a larger project by the government called the 4 Major Rivers Project, and it was a very controversial plan to begin with. It was a plan to connect rivers, to create a better ship, to create a ship cargo transportation route, and it was also supposed to do these things and clean the water and be better for the environment. But there was actually a lot of kind of hasty preparations that went into this project, and a lot of people initially, a lot of the general public initially was not on board with the project. But as the government poured money into the project, a lot of that opposition started to fade away. There were other issues that Korea had to deal with, and everyone started to back away except Jio. And so I initially wanted to make this documentary about her. I wanted to come and work on a project that just looked at her environmentalist actions. Because as a Buddhist nun too, she was kind of pulling these very unprecedented actions. I mean, despite the progressive side to Sun Buddhism that I mentioned, there's still a lot of patriarchy in the Buddhist community in Korea, and so as a nun, she was really still doing a lot of stuff that was just not anything anyone had done before. So initially I came I arrived in May, and she had started a, I'll show you, there's a picture of this actually. Oh, that's the dam actually being constructed on the river. And she started a tent camp on the river in May. I didn't make it to the first one, but I made it to the second one in June. And she basically had groups of people come out for like 3 days, two nights and 3 days to the river, and she held kind of a session where she talked about the environmental situation, and then you were in essence trying to enjoy the river as it is before it changes. So when I first met her, I took that photograph of her that I showed you guys. Actually, I'll go back to it really quick because it was the biggest mistake I made, taking the photograph. I shouldn't have taken the photograph of her. I really shouldn't have. Because I had known coming to Korea that she was so severely hurt the last time that she interacted with this activism by the media. And of course, you know, like me, tall, redheaded American coming in with a camera and being like, hey, I'm taking photos of you. Know, she totally shut down when I took the photograph of her. And I have attempted to interview her several times. I've requested interviews, and each time she's declined. And she's actually been working on her own film, surprisingly. She films the river herself. And so she's actually presenting her footage at the Joge Temple here in Seoul next week, or the week after I'll be attending. But despite the fact that she declined my interviews, I've continued to go. There's that Korean saying, I don't know the Korean actually, but you have to cut a tree 10 times before it falls down. So I've tried to be very careful in the way I've done it. I've tried not to push myself, but it's really hard not to, especially in the other interviews that I've had with other people, not to focus on her. She's just such a fascinating character. But her method, as an engaged Buddhist, she works primarily as an activist. And her activism, as I said, is unprecedented as a nun. But many have accused her of being too extreme. And the people around her now are less and less of the Buddhist community and more of environmental activist community. So I was looking at an interview that I had done a month or so ago, and as I was watching the interview, I realized that the person who I had interviewed was trying to kind of tiptoe around the fact that he had been one of the people who had initially supported her during the first project and then kind of pulled out when it got hard. Because there's a big difference between monastic life and lay persons, secular life. Unlike Japan, where Buddhism has become very secularized, and they're not even monks, they're priests. They come in at 9, they put on their robes, and then they check out at 5, and they go home to their families. Whereas monks in Korea are like continuously, they're continuously being a monk. They're continuously eating vegetarian meals. They're living by these values, and so there's a strong, I guess, barrier that's formed between people that are just secular and people that are monastic, because people that are from the secular world don't feel that they can care as much about the environment as or whatever the situation is, because they don't feel. When I talked to the next monk, he mentioned that when a tree branch is cut, Jiho feels as if it's her own arm being cut. And we can't really understand that feeling necessarily the same way that she does. So, to move on to the next monk, I want to talk about Tobop Snim. Last month I traveled to Jirisan, to Shilsan Temple. It was cold, it snowed. But I went to meet this guy. He's another very prominent figure of Korean Engaged Buddhism, and he's quite different from Jio Sunim in both his philosophy and method. Actually, Dobop Sunim considers himself a philosopher. When I interviewed him, he explained that he came to his monastic life with two fundamental questions. When his mother was deathly ill, when he was 20 years old, his mother was dying, and he realized in that moment that that all living beings are scared of death, and he wanted to know how to relieve the suffering of death. And he second wanted to know how can we live in happiness, how can we live as content beings. So he began his studies through the Flower Ornament Sutra, Palm Sutra, and it's a very dense, old, sutra, but it's at the base of Sun Buddhism teachings. And in order to answer these questions, Dobop invented a symbol, and he got up during the interview and he went over to his wall and he had drawn the symbol on his wall. And I thought, it looks kind of crazy. It looks kind of like a Native American symbol. But he explained all of the elements to me. And so here you have man, then here is animal, then bird, and fish, and then this represents plants, forest, and trees. And then this is the sun, and this is the moon. Now this is actually really Korean, I think. If you look at the thrones of the Chosun dynasty, you see that behind them. But the symbol he invented with a professor, actually a designer, a symbol designer, symbologist, I think, yeah, from Hongdae University, and essentially through the symbol, he explained to me that naturally we believe in our own ownership of our own identity. We own our own soul, but Dobop insists that that's not actually what is going on. He says that if you subtract any element from the symbol, it falls apart. Any aspect of that symbol, if you take it away, it becomes unbalanced. And likewise, if you subtract any one of these elements from life, you won't be able to survive. So thus, you cannot exist without the existence of every other element, and so you are not you. We exist because the sun exists. Essentially, livelihood is dependent on the existence of all other livelihood. And we have to respect that relationship in order to live and find happiness. So, as I said, he was a very, very different figure from Jio Sunim, and he was the one who explained to me that Jio treats nature as if she's Mother Nature, as if it's her child. Dobop doesn't necessarily remove himself from nature, but he has this ability to compromise a little bit because he understands the relationship between interdependency. And so that was my interview with Dobop Sunim, and the third individual that I want to talk about, actually just briefly, really, because I haven't met him yet, but he's the third most important figure in Engaged Buddhism in Korea. His name is Pomyun Snim. Pomyun Snim founded the Jogye Society, which is part of the Jogye order, which is the main order of Buddhism that operates under some Buddhism in Korea. It operates separately from the Jogye order, though. It's still a part of the Jogye order, but it operates separately. And it initially started under very environmentally driven issues, but now in today, in kind of the politics of today, they've focused a lot more, the Jogye Society has focused a lot more on North Korean refugees, providing aid and support to them, as well as setting up educational systems and supplying aid and funding to a community in India, actually. Part of the reason is that the Jongto Society has become the most involved with INEB, the International Network of Engaged Buddhists that I attended with earlier. So I've been going and attending lectures at the Jongto Society here in Seoul, but I haven't been able to get in touch with Pomyun Sunim yet because during this past election year he became very politically active, very politically enrolled for Anton Su. So I'm actually going to interview him in the beginning of May, and I'm really looking forward to that. He is, of the three, most politically involved. He's really stationed here in Seoul. That's where his support is. Dolph Sunim is off in Jiri Mountain. Like, he's a philosopher. He goes and he focuses on his ideology, and he writes books, and he stays committed to, actually he's very committed to his own society and maintaining the environmental ideals in the surrounding area. And in comparison to these two, Jiul Sunim is the most project-driven. She's kind of attempted specific projects, and so she's also the most passionate person, the most passionate individual. One of the other things that I felt when I was around her was like this very negative environment. Like, not to say that her work is negative at all, but that she's kind of in a constant battlefield, that she's kind of surrounded by negativity. And I think that that takes a big toll on her as an individual. I know that these monks and nuns are very strict, and they strictly abide by their religious kind of their religious role, because they have to. That's the role that monks and nuns play. However, as an individual, you can tell that each person deals with the pressure in a different way, and she's put herself in the most compromising situation, and yet been the least compromising. So I wanted to conclude actually with a clip. I hate for the last thing to be said. I'd rather it not be words out of my mouth. I'd rather have it be a visual, because I am working on a documentary, and I am still attempting to interview Jiul, and I'm looking forward to interviewing Pomyun Sunim, and really, even despite the fact that my project took such a drastic turn in the beginning, it's really taught me everything I've needed to learn about Engaged Buddhism. So I've really grown a lot through this experience. Okay, this is a clip that I made from a visit to Chiljan Temple in Ansan, and it's just a music. So, thank you. Thank you very much. So, I guess this is the questions. So I'll take any questions now, and I'll try to answer them as I can.
We didn't hear what was the outcome of the protest against the KTX.
The KTX was built.
I know it was built. Did it go around the mountain, or did it go?
It went through. I think, actually, yeah, I'm pretty sure it went through.
And I mean, the Four Rivers was completely approved.
Actually, it's still kind of underway. There's a lot of money that's still being put into the construction. It's really strange. When we went and we visited the tent school, we actually go to the construction site. And the second time we weren't allowed on the construction site. So they actually, it's kind of been an ongoing process, and there have been a couple times where they've been able to successfully postpone the building of the dams, and then there's been other places where they haven't been able to successfully do that, and the construction continues. So it's still going on right now. I don't think that it's been completed, but it is underway.
I guess my real question, though, is what's the future of Engaged Buddhism? Taking on these big projects that are, in the end, virtually unstoppable. What do you do now?
Well, I think that Buddhism in Korea has kind of gone under the radar for a very long time. And so there's a lot of very calm behavior. And there's a lot of going with the way that society moves. So it hasn't been until really recent, like the past 20 years, that these engaged Buddhists have really stood up and started to concretely act. I think, in the past 20 years, more specifically. But I think that despite the fact that Buddhism has gone under the radar for so long, Korea really has such a long history with Buddhism that it will continue to play a very strong role, because it's so fundamental to the identity. As I said, it's so deeply embedded that it's kind of impossible for it not to show in a lot of ways. I don't know, if they rock the boat too much with certain activity, it might hurt them, but I think some engaged Buddhists understand that. Others are more driven by projects. Others are more driven by very, very, almost innocent ideals, you know what I mean, about society. But I think that it's going to become more and more of an international component, actually, too, because Korean Buddhism has such a long history, and it's a very stable history. They'll continue to play a very strong role in Korea. So. Yes?
How does, if at all, does Engaged Buddhism transform the nature of this larger institutional Buddhism? What has been the response there? Are they on board with it, or is there something backlash? I'm curious to know.
I think that goes to the degree of how engaged you are. If we go back to the idea of big B Buddhism and little B Buddhism, there is still a very strong institution in Korea. The Jogye-chong order is actually my affiliation, and that hasn't necessarily been, I haven't needed to go to them for a lot of the things that I've needed because they are at the institution. They have to go by very conservative values, and they have a lot of battles that they have to deal with. When I first arrived in May, there was a huge scandal that was happening where there was some, I think it was a sex scandal, I don't know what it was exactly. It was, I don't remember specifically, except that the monk from the temple that I was staying at in Busan had to come up to Seoul because it was, he was called up to Seoul to come and handle the problems. So there's still a lot of problems internally among monks and nuns, the role of sexes, and that still proves a big problem for Buddhism as a whole, kind of. But there are organizations like INEB who are extremely progressive. I mean, these people were really interesting because they were just from all over the place, but they really kind of went to the basics, you know, and so they completely operate on Little B Buddhism, and kind of abandon. They don't completely abandon the Big B Buddhism structure, but they kind of take it with a grain of salt, I guess. I think there's like a balance that still has to play out between the two. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, you know, Martin Luther King, in the letter from the Birmingham jail, drew on a number of different spiritual traditions and making his point that, you know, he wasn't going to stop, and that I mean, from Protestant to Catholic to Jewish philosophy and theology, and you know, he had such a clear moral vision of what it is he was doing and what was needed to be done. Is there any momentum like that behind this movement?
Well, I think you know, it's interesting that you bring that up because when I went to visit Dolbop Sunim in Shilsangsa, they told me to go. The temple state coordinator told me to go into the tea room and look at a painting on the wall, and the painting was just a calligraphy that had been done by Thich Nhat Hanh. So Thich Nhat Hanh had come to that temple in Jirisan, and it's a really small temple. I mean, it's a really poor temple. It was kind of hard because I mean, just doing the temple state there was difficult because there was no electricity. I mean, there was electricity for lights, but the bathrooms were all, you know, the holes in the ground outside, you know, that kind of thing. So, where am I going with this? I think that they're interconnected. I think that I was surprised to see that Thich Nhat Hanh had visited that temple, and I think that there's kind of connections between all of these people, all these spiritual leaders. I think that they're not just necessarily they need to be Buddhist. I think that they all kind of have something in common. They all recognize in one another. And Korea has the dynamic capacity to kind of support that individual. I don't know if that individual has necessarily risen up yet. I think that there's been a lot of very well-meaning people, and they've done a lot of really good things, and they've taken on very, very strong spiritual roles in their communities, and in Korea as a nation. But Korea is still kind of, right now, there's still this, you know, kind of Buddhism is still taking a big turn right now here. It's still taking a while to make that big shift over, and so there's still kind of a quietness there. But there are these individuals who have stood up, and not just stood up, but like kind of made really big gestures, painted really big strokes. And yeah, I think Korea has the capacity, for sure. Yeah?
You mentioned that about 20 years ago, Engaged Buddhism became more of a reality, and you said in South Korea. What was the change that really sparked that change?
I think it began with the social movement shift. I think that monks and nuns started to take a stronger role when the Minjung movement was happening in Korea, and but that was kind of with the development over time. You know, Korea's gone through this huge shift. I mean, and so I think that Buddhism started there. That was where it kind of sparked to be more engaged. And then because of conferences that they've both hosted and gone to within the Buddhist community in support of reestablishing women lineage of nuns in other countries, or environmental kind of conferences, that it's very slowly kind of inched back up to kind of this international platform. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes. I'll just say, thanks for your talk, Andrew. It was fascinating.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I'm just very curious about this INEB meeting that you went to, because I understand that people are tied together through Buddhism there, but I imagine some Ambedkarites, Indian Dalit Buddhist, it has a very different understanding of what engaged Buddhism is to maybe a Jodoshin minister. So I'm curious what kind of conversation was going on there?
There's like a lot of conversations. I said that it was like a executive board meeting. So actually, a lot of the I was sitting there listening to a lot of just this is what we're doing here, here, and here. Let's talk about what we need to shift. So I didn't get a chance to go to the big international conference where they really do big delegation kind of workshops and that kind of thing. There was a section of the workshops, and this conference was more aimed towards Japanese Buddhism because we were in Japan. So they were essentially talking about post 3/11, how Buddhist leaders in Japan could kind of help reestablish support in Japanese community after the tsunami nuclear disaster. So the conference that they're holding this year is in Myanmar, I believe, or Malaysia. I think it's Malaysia actually, and there's also they're having talks between Muslims and Buddhists, so there's a lot of struggles that they try to tackle, not only among internal struggles between Buddhist groups, because there's fighting there, but they also address very international problems too. There was actually, I haven't had time to really focus on the material, but there was like a very bad, angry warfare going on between Muslims and Buddhists in Southeast Asia, and so I haven't focused on that material, but I'm very interested, and so they address a lot of different issues. But the individuals that decide to come, the individuals who are invited to kind of be a part of the conference, actually, I mean, not that you have to get an invitation to go, but it's not like that. But they kind of come prepared with kind of an open mind. So, yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. This is such a wonderful time. Thank you so much.